Bonjour à tous et bonjour à toutes. Nous avons vous laissé le temps
Morning to all of you. We will give you some time to join us in this new session, but I would like to start by welcoming you to this International Trade Union Forum on Ecological and Social Transition. This is the second day devoted to this forum, which started yesterday. Actually, it started several months ago because this forum was co-designed with more than 150 organizations from 4 different continents. So through this week, all through the week, you will be able to participate in 17 roundtables with over 6,000 registrations for this forum. We have people connecting from all over the world, from South Korea, Spain, Brazil, Algeria, Canada, United States, which means this forum is truly international. Our forum is organized today by CGT with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Untitled Global Information Institute from Paris, and the Trade Unions for Democracy. My name is Nassim Ashouch. I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Institute in the office we have in Brussels. Today, we will start the session on reorientation and industrial diversification. I will give you some technical directions that we have to recall before we start any session. Every session is supposed to be interactive, participative. You have a chat box on the right side of your screen where we are inviting you to ask questions you wish to the different panelists interact, and we will try to select them and answer to all your questions in order to have a true debate today. Thank you again for joining us today. I will, in one word, make a small presentation of this forum before opening this session on the industrial reorientation and diversification. This session is interested by the question on ecological transition. And this is what we will be talking about today and all through this forum. We will integrate the transition question and the role of the workers, their stakes in the decisions affecting our reorientation and transition, ecologically and socially speaking. I'm not going to devote more time to this and will now give the floor immediately to our first panelists. The first thing we will do is introduce the different situations in different countries to understand the stakes of the industrial reorientation or diversification. For the first intervention, and as he will need to leave us very early, I will give the floor to Michael Venturi, Deputy Secretary General of the Metallo FGTB Federation. So, Michael, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear me sounding clear. I would like to start by thanking the organizers of this initiative, and this will allow the metallurgy workers from the FGTB to share reflections on reorientation and industrial diversification, something that is a very trendy topic, and it has specific interests in the labor work and for the capital for reasons that are diametrically opposed. And I will now explain what I mean by that. As a trade union organization, no matter what topic we are dealing with, the worker, employed or unemployed, must occupy the center of the debate. That is, that the worker will always be considered uh, someone for whom the working conditions, the quality of the employment, the training, and the rights, social and others, be respected with a better distribution of the wealth. And the topic of today is not exception to this way of looking at things. But before we share our way of looking at the situation, I believe there's a reflection needed on the way we have to consider wealth as a whole and the way to produce it. The employment, full employment, not be considered as a result of the economic growth only, but must be considered in view of a reorientation of the activity. And this needs two things. On one side, awareness, individually and collectively speaking, and also ideological openness to the trade and competitivity issues. And this first reflection, rights, implies a need of the participation of all the forces, be this nationally, Europeanly speaking, or at international level. And there's a lot of work to be done. And if I am taking the time to talk about the European industrial policy, even here, some breakthroughs are needed. On one side, the treaties and the budget regulations, which are limiting or blocking investment in production. The fact that it's counterproductive to think only of the private initiative to relaunch the economy in general and of the industry in particular. Therefore, we are looking for a more interventionist policy from the state, and also on anything related with the reappropriation of or re-ownership of the public tool. Research and development now. To us, it's important to reorient the budgets according to the needs and give a particular attention to its application, its industrialization, or its commercialization. With all the experience I have in different sectors I work with, I can see that too many research centers are financed by big groups. And even if a project is innovating, if this project cannot prove to be profitable on the short term, this project will not receive any financing. We also believe that it's important to redefine the priority industrial sectors, integrating the whole value chain, be this value chain national, European, or global. And finally, we believe that a global reflection is needed for a adjusting policy at the borders, thinking of a strategic economy, not to be protectionist, as I could read lately, but collectively with the idea of defending the general interests for the workers and avoid, social dumping as we have been affected by during the crisis of COVID. Today, the reality has shifted in spite of the different recovery and resilience plans. Diversification, industrial diversification, takes place too often thinking of competitivity, maximizing benefits, reorienting technology, environment, and the social aspects, thinking only about capital and increasing the capital. I will give you now two examples. I would like with this to show you how important for us the development of circular economy is important in industry, in particular in the metallurgy. And this is essential to our trade union association. At economic point of view, the global demand in commodities has increased over the last years, and Belgium has not too much raw materials, so we have to look at foreign countries for that. So our economy depends on the political changes in the world. So a circular economy will reduce our vulnerability, and it is important to think especially on the value chains that can be used locally to open new perspectives, industrially speaking and employment speaking. Then we also have there's also an ecological aspect. Circular economy in our sector can contribute to fight climate change, and this needs investment, a industrial policy which will make this a priority. Therefore, we will need infrastructures, workers, and the workers will need to be given the opportunity to develop the needed capacities for that. So it's true that there's a very long way to go. And now I come to two examples I was referring to, which will be very short as time is of the essence. It's in the pole on metallurgy in Belgium and Wallonia in particular. We are pursuing the treatment and value of the metals, thanks to the partnership between our with the Center of Research Center of Metallurgy, John Cockrell's company, the University of Liège, and the implication of the social partners is giving its fruits, thinking of development and mastering of all the sector involved in metallurgy, the mastering of technology, talking about kilns, replacements, etc. And finally, the innovation and the industrialization. The second example I want to give is this siderurgy. Here, it's very important to think of the energy transition of the sector. Our industry is today responsible for for over 5% of the GES emissions and 30% of the industrial gas emissions. So their impact on the climate change is a certain fact. But it has an effect on the health of the workers, on public health in general, and therefore this is one of an important challenge for our sector. This means that we will need to improve the processes in the kilns or transform the and think of other methods of producing relying on electricity. So as a conclusion, I wanted to talk on one side of the stakes of reconversion and reorientation, taking into account the general interest, well-being at work, and the danger that the capital is only thinking of trade and competitivity without thinking of a fair distribution of the wealth. And all other evolutions are possible, and I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Michael Venturi. This was a very rich presentation. You mentioned several points that you presented in your intervention. I believe that you already are putting milestones on the questions that we will be talking about during this meeting. You talked about the need of stepping away from a model where competitivity is at the center of everything, and the need of the intervention of the state, thinking of a strategy where the workers would occupy a center place. I would like now to turn towards the south of Europe and to have Mr. Carlos Camarero, Confederal Secretary for Environment and Health of Comisiones Obreras, and he will talk us about the stakes for his trade union and question related to industrial conversion in Spain. Mr. Camarero, please, you have the floor.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas
Hello
gracias.
to all of you. Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation to present CGT's point of view, Comisiones Obreras' point of view on this roundtable. I'd like to start by pointing out that the energy transition and the ecological transition are fundamental for the industrial transformation of the world, the whole world, not just the industrialized countries. There's a series of factors that will have an influence in the industrial agenda. To start with, the energy transition, the decarbonization that is needed in the world is something that we've seen in many international congresses derived from the Paris agreements and different initiatives at EU level. The European institutions already have different norms that force countries to comply and follow an energy transition. And this also defines the industrial policies. Industrial policies have to follow decarbonization, not just of the electrical sector, but also the rest of the energy sector, transport, the way that buildings are managed, agriculture. All of these fields have an energy component that has to be taken into account when talking about decarbonization. We see that these changes are going to disrupt many fields, employment, for instance. And it's important to take them into account and to plan for policies that enable us to deal with possible consequences. We think that there will be new sectors appearing. In the case of energies, we know that carbon industries and thermal plants are being replaced with other sources of energy. It's true that some countries are going quicker than others, but we also have other aspects, such as the rehabilitation of buildings, which in itself also represents a very large industry, a very large source of employment. We see the use of new materials for construction, and this offers new opportunities. So we need to adapt to these new challenges. We spoke about transport on another meeting. Transport also has to be transformed according to industry. It is very linked to the transformative industries. Spain, for instance, is a very important car producer in Europe, and we see that the automobile sector is being transformed in order to produce electrical vehicles. And it is now focusing on mobility services for the urban sector, especially. On the other hand, we see that in aviation, a lot of changes are taking place. It is difficult to decarbonize the aviation sector. So this conversion will also affect the use of devices inside airplanes, for instance. So it's many elements to take into account. And for us, this also affects the tourism sector. At a national level, we see transformation of the aviation sector, and new options appearing in the railway sector for tourism options with rail transport instead of airplanes. And of course, this transformation has consequences for labor. It's a transformation that is derived from the energy transformation. And we also have the environment aspect that has to be taken into account. We try to have clean production in these industries. We try for these dangerous substances, chemical substances, to be replaced by options that are not so polluting in industrial processes. We also reflect on a circular economy. This subject is very interesting to us because we see that on the one hand, we have products such as plastic, materials, packages made of plastics is a problem that we see all around the world. So we need to transform, we need to change this into more ecological packages, and this of course changes the economy. Cardboard packaging, for instance. The circular economy is important because it reflects on material and how material is produced. Metal, for instance, has more and more scarcity. We see that they're difficult to extract. They become more and more expensive as well, and it's difficult to make them circulate. So we need to promote recycling and recovery activities with materials. So there comes a new sector, which is the recycling sector. We know that the recycling sector is also generating a lot of employment. So in this regards, we need to reflect on how the ecological transformation, where it is headed, what the directions are to follow, and how we can promote the creation of employment, how trade unions can promote what we call a just transition. And there's two factors to take into account if we want for this transition to take place in the right place. Planning. Planning is fundamental. We need clear plans, clear strategies at European level, for instance, roadmaps. We know that there's a lot of planning taking place at European level, but we also need programs for a just transition. We know that sectorial developments must come with just transition strategies. Spain has now started with an energy transition. It closed nuclear plants, thermal plants, but we also need more energy transformation in the car sector, aviation sector, tourism. As I said, a lot is needed. We need more planning, sectorial planning that goes hand in hand with our activities so we can really be present in those processes at local and territorial level. And that we also give sufficient information so that all of the employees that are losing their jobs are trained and acquire competences and knowledge for new jobs that are now appearing. And of course, this can be done through social dialogue, through tripartite dialogue. We need to be there at company level and join that with the trade union activities. So this is the framework that we try to work in to be able to deal with these very complex processes. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup pour cette intervention qui complète celle précédente et qui centre aussi la question qui propose plusieurs points sur la question des opportunités ou des secteurs qui s'ouvrent avec la question de la décarbonisation, notamment, vous l'avez précisé, M. Camarero, toujours la vision d'avoir une certaine vision stratégique et l'importance de soutenir les industries avec des plans qui parfois existent, parfois n'existent pas. Et je pense que sur ça, peut-être
that sometimes don't exist. So we might have various different point of views, which may be quite different and will indeed complement these words that have been centered on Europe, basically. Therefore, I'm going to invite Mr. Ling-Soon Lee, the Confederal Secretary in charge of environmental, climatological and transport issues for ACTA from South Korea, who has wanted to be here with us in spite of the late hour currently in South Korea. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Lee, and you have the floor.
Good to meet you all.
Merci beaucoup.
So I was not able to participate in the preparation meetings, so I don't think we had a sufficient discussion up to date, which is unfortunate, but I would like to talk about some of the dilemmas that we face in Korea today, and there is especially a lot of dilemma and challenges facing the automotive industry. So I would like to tell you about some of the directions that the KMWU, the Metal Workers Union, is going to take. So let me share my screen first. So I'm not allowed to share my screen. So can somebody allow me to share my screen, please?
I think we have
le canal français, est-ce que c'est la même chose dans les autres langues?
peut y aller là. Normalement, ça devrait marcher.
So anyway, I wanted to share my screen, but it seems that we're going to have some difficulties doing that. So I won't share my screen and I'll just make my presentation nonetheless. So anyway, in Korea, in regard to climate change, there has been some proposals regarding doing away with the coal-fired thermal plants as part of the decarbonization policy, and also changing to electrification. And so we are an automotive industry. So can I go ahead, please? So anyway, we're an automotive company, so I'm going to be talking about the auto industry. So if you look at the Korean situation in the OEM, we have a lot of electrification, and so about 10,000 jobs in the electrification have been created. But the internal combustion engine jobs have also 20,000 jobs have decreased. And so if you look at the number of parts companies, if we consider complete electrification, then we believe that about 3,000 parts companies will disappear from the industry. And so if we just look at one single industry in the face of a transition, there's going to be a huge change to employment. And so we have to have safety net in place. It's going to be very important. And so the government, as part of the Green New Deal and Digital New Deal, is coming forth with some safety net related policies. But if you look at the government's New Deal or the Digital New Deal, it seems that the government is taking over what should be done by the corporations, and the safety net, rather than coming up with real safety net policies, the government seems to be focusing more on retraining. And so it's not going to be taking place overnight, but the government is not coming up with any details about how it's going to perform retraining. And so it has no details whatsoever about the Green New Deal and employment effects, etc. And so if you look at the combustion engine ICE parts, there's going to be a lot of jobs lost. And so there has to be some policies in place to ensure they find new jobs and also have proper welfare in the meantime. So if you look at the government policies and the government direction, the KMWU have decided that we need to come up with a counter proposal. And so what we are saying is that we believe we have to have some principles when it comes to a just transition in the industrial sector in order to overcome the climate crisis and in order to be able to respond to technological development. The workers have to be able to become protagonists. And also when there is a technological change, when there is a decarbonization, we need a new production mode that is in harmony with people, and we have to be able to create decent jobs. And the just transition in the industrial sector has to be a process towards resolving the existing socioeconomic equality by establishing an industrial ecosystem strongly that's in the interest of the public. And so the KMWU is seeking to reform our internal institutions and some of the regulations in order to make this possible. And so we are saying that we need a nationwide bargaining regarding this industrial transition. So when it comes to the industrial transition, we believe that the workers have to be ensured with job security. And when there is an unemployment, we have to ensure that there's a safety net in place for the unemployed workers, etc. But anyway, so we have decided that we need to demand for an industrial transition agreement. So we believe that, first of all, we have to take on a proactive stance rather than just a reactive response to the transition. And secondly, the industrial transition should not be left solely to the discretion of the companies, but it has to be decided by co-determination. So we believe that co-determination between the management and the workers is very important. So the co-determination has to be in a way that it strengthens labor rights. It also has to strengthen workers' control, and it has to be able to transform the profit-centered production and the consumption and system. And we have to be able to build a social system where the public interest is prioritized. Actually, in Korea, we all already have a similar kind of example. In regard to the safety net during a transitional period, in a province called the Chungcheongnam-do, the provincial government has come up with a transition fund for a just transition. So it has legislated an ordinance on the establishment and operation of a transition fund. And so basically, the fund will be run by various stakeholders. It will be participated and decided by the various stakeholders, those who are affected by the transition. And so we believe that workers also have to be able to participate in the process of operating or managing this transition fund. The Korean government is actually in support of transition promoted by the companies. And so these are, we have to respond to that. And so these are some of the principles and directions we have for the just transition. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lee, et encore désolé pour ces difficultés techniques. Je crois qu'il devait avoir un PowerPoint qui n'a pas pu apparemment être présenté, donc il vous est envoyé là. On pourra peut-être revenir tout à l'heure sur certains points. sur lesquels vous voulez revenir à l'aide du PowerPoint, on pourra refaire une
we will be able to
présentation un peu plus
do a
exhaustive.
presentation, more exhaustive presentation later on, I believe. But I believe you already mentioned some important points on the Korean situation, and also, oh well, here's a PowerPoint. I can see it on the screen now. So if there are some points you would like to develop now, Mr. Lee, I now give you the opportunity to do so, if you want to give us some more information.
지금 파워포인트.
Okay, so if you look at the PowerPoint slide, so this is basically what we have in mind in a transitional period. One of the most important things is we don't know how long the transition is going to take. And the government is talking about job creation, but it's really uncertain as to the scale of that. And during the transitional period, we need a very strong safety net, and that is very important. And in order to create the safety net, we need to ensure jobs, we need to ensure basic wages, we need a wealth tax, we need a financing by the government, fiscal policies by the government. And so, of course, education and retraining would be important, but we believe that social safety net has to be strengthened. And I think for workers, it's a social safety net that we need to emphasize. And just last thing, this is the example that I told you about in the Chungcheongnam-do province. Like I said, there was a fund that was created to finance the just transition. So there are various stakeholders. You have the local government participating, you have the trade unions participating, and civil society organizations who are participating in the decision-making process of how to manage and use the fund. And so this is another option that we have, and I think this is a challenge that we face in a transition period. So this is basically it for my presentation. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Et merci pour cette présentation et ce document. Juste très brièvement, pour reprendre quelques points qui me paraissent importants à mettre en perspective, le fait que vous présentiez la question de la transition et de l'évolution des emplois allant de pair avec la question de la protection sociale, la question d'un emploi, de bons emplois et d'emplois protégés, qui est aussi au centre, je crois, de beaucoup de préoccupations et de lutte aussi des salariés pour protéger ces emplois. Et on voit qu'on ne peut pas séparer ces deux questions. Et la question de la formation est aussi centrale dans ce que vous nous avez présenté. Sans prendre non plus plus de temps, j'aimerais partir cette fois-ci sur un autre continent et inviter Guillaume Valois, qui est membre du syndicat AIMTA du Canada, à venir nous présenter les enjeux de son syndicat et de la région.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour tout le monde. Oui, chez moi, il est très tôt, donc je vais peut-être être un peu embrouillé, décousu, mais ça va s'améliorer avec le temps. Oui, c'est ça. Nous, pour pas recouper, parce qu'il y a quand même beaucoup d'enjeux qui se rejoignent, peu importe la région du monde dans laquelle on se trouve. Je vois qu'il n'y a pas d'anglais pour le moment. Est-ce que la traduction fonctionne bien? Ou c'était un vieux message, peut-être. Bref, je vais continuer. Tout ce qui est par rapport à la formation, à la transition aussi pour la question de la gestion des brevets, la recherche et développement, tout ça a déjà été dit, ça se recoupe. Je crois que nous, justement, par rapport
Guillaume,
à...
je suis
Oui.
désolé de vous couper, mais j'ai l'impression qu'il n'y a plus de traduction en anglais. C'est ce qui s'inscrit sur le chat.
Oui, c'est ça. C'est ce que j'ai vu aussi. Est-ce que vous voulez que j'attende?
Est-ce qu'on peut faire un petit point, voir si il y a un problème avec le
qu'on m'entend pas, ouais.
français sur l'anglais.
Non.
Encore une fois, on s'excuse, mais c'est vrai que c'est indépendant de nos volontés. Les traducteurs travaillent très dur aussi. Et ça prouve aussi les limites du virtuel parfois. On ne peut pas arriver à remplacer les interactions réelles. Mais en tout cas, je pense qu'on arrive en tout cas à avoir des échanges qui sont très, très riches et qui font écho, même si parfois les points divergent aussi, ce qui est intéressant de mettre en perspective aujourd'hui. On regarde un peu si ça s'améliorait du côté de l'interprétation en anglais. Est-ce qu'on m'entend sur la chaîne en anglais ou pas?
Non, malheureusement, on ne t'entend pas.
Est-ce que l'anglais, ça fonctionne?
Non.
Apparemment, on n'est pas encore reparti. Ça fait, oui, c'est comme je le disais, ça fait partie de ces petits challenges. On va essayer de voir si ça peut être remis assez rapidement. Si ce n'était pas le cas, j'ai l'impression qu'on devra peut-être continuer sans traduction à l'anglais, ce qui est bien sûr évidemment embêtant. Peut-être que si vous devez prendre un verre d'eau ou vous resservir un café pour ceux pour qui c'est le matin, c'est peut-être le moment. Oui, ça peut être aussi une solution. Alors, on me fait signe que l'intervenant pourrait parler en anglais et serait traduit en français, ce qui permettrait d'avoir le...
Voilà. Excellent.
Merci beaucoup. Guillaume, à vous.
I'm on the English channel now. I guess everybody can hear me.
Apparemment, on entend maintenant le traducteur en français, quoi. En anglais,
You should
pardon.
be hearing me on the English
Donc apparemment,
channel now.
ça devrait être OK.
Let the organizers know that everything's solved now. So I'm trying not to repeat the arguments that were already presented before, trying to recover from the delay. So all the problems that we have with the licenses, training related to transition is something that is global. Even in Canada, we have the same problem. There are many initiatives or decisions that are made. Public financing is allocated to some initiatives, but without very often consulting the workers previously. When there are new technologies or new initiatives for transition, and we have issues that are different from the public companies. And another problem that we could hear in the other interventions is the workforce. As trade unions here have a lot of work to do to mobilize and making people understand that people may lose a lot if they do not adapt. The working conditions, we cannot go on working as we did before, and changing for the sake of environment is important, of course, but people must come out of their sphere of confidence. There's a lot of work done in Canada and Quebec that if there's a transition to a new industry, what happens very often is that if we are leaving the production of gas engines, this will mean that people will have difficulties. So it's important to have a dialogue between the stakeholders, and we have to think of educating the grassroots first, so that the transition be not only environmental but also a legislative and social transition, and this is something that has to be considered. Lately, we worked a lot at political level to have our members are mainly aerospatial workers, and in Quebec, we try to have initiatives for improving the recycling. In Canada, the argument is very often that we are the place where many aircraft are produced, but for a transition, the recovery or refurbishment of the aircraft could probably be one way of having the employment not to suffer too much from the new conditions. So that's one of the examples we thought of. Politically and internally, we made some steps, but so far we haven't progressed too much. So I'm not going to take much more time in my presentation in order not to repeat what all my other colleagues already said, and I prefer to have some more time to discuss with everybody else.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Donc encore une fois des points qui se rejoignent, et la question de
again, we have here some issues that we have been talked about before, especially when we disemployment and people getting laid off is a topic that comes back very often, and we will talk about it on Friday again. We realize that everything is linked and that we must be able to discuss them in a cohesive way. You also had the opportunity to hear some political claims and the importance of having a strategic vision and a consistent vision of the public authorities. So I believe that now we had several presentations on the importance of the position of the workers and democracy in the transition and reconversion. And I believe that now the time has come to try to talk about concrete proposals for reconversion that have been brought up by the workers and the trade unions, thinking of their tools and come up with proposals that can be ecological, social, and can suppose a production added value. I will now give the floor to Sylvain Delettre from the CGT Thales to talk us about the situation today. Good morning to all of you. I would like to talk about the Thales Group and talk about the diversification, medical diversification. Thales is a French group originally, but we are present all over Europe, the world, and we are manufacturing defense material and security material. We work for Airbus and Boeing. Two out of three aircraft are landing with Thales radars on board, and we are with this diversification experience in the medical world.
What is the starting point? The starting point is, yes, is a classical sale of production of
Pardon, je pense qu'on a un interprète qui est dans le canal général du FLOR. Vous pouvez y remédier. Ou de canal français. Allez-y, Sylvain, pour voir.
Donc, pour expliquer, historiquement, en 2012, on a une filiale
we have a subsidiary, an agricultural one,
Trixel, qui fait la production de détecteurs de
producing
très grande sensibilité,
X-rays detection, very sensible one, which is a basic component of scanner and medical tooling sold to the whole world by Thales, to most great actor of medical intelligence. So this is a strategic decision to be made by the direction passing to a purely military activities, which was announced in a meeting under the pretext that is not a basic thing for military occupations. And nowadays, conversely, we see the creation of a medical branch within the Thales group. This is not a miracle, it's just a result of a fight, a struggle within. How was it possible to influence such a global group about the need to keep the medical aspect of Thales and redirect its activities? So first and foremost, there is the struggle for payment for the workers, which is a classical fight, of course. people defend their working tool. But it's more complicated than that, because in Grenoble we have a whole system of research with the presence of CEA, the Nuclear Research Center, the ST part for electrical components, all the universities in the region. So there is the whole ecosystem of research, which makes it for Thales workers to do as their colleagues do. Within a whole history, a culture of intervention within the management, namely Thales workers held by CGT, not only want to keep their job, but also to see a coherent strategy being implemented, among other things about nuclear energy. So we fight for a coherent strategy within the group. And you have to know that medical group of the Thomson group, formerly within Thales, very important. Until '86, there was a very well-developed medical branch, and unfortunately, it was sold in '86 to General Electric, which was a shock, a real shock for the whole community. So also, Grenoble workers were not alone in this. We all participated in the medical congress with medical doctors and treating manufacturers, treating equipment manufacturers. And we visited the hospital centers to explain that certain components were extremely sensitive and as they were produced, which was very good for patients. This struggle went on for 9 years. We had to create a website which was called Imagerie d'Avenir, future imagery, and we are now at the 10th bulletin, where we explain that there are 2 projects within CGT and the Grenoble workers, 2 industrials projects that have been accepted by the government, because within the National Council for Industry in France, there is a special commission for that. So it was accepted within the sector of medical equipment. And there are communications on the creation of a medical branch within Thales. So the whole thing has been reversed, which was difficult. There were quite some doubt at some points, I must reckon. But when you see the persons interested and the persons responsible, politicians, medical centers, all these were contacted, and to the present result, where in Europe, Thales will create a branch, a medical branch located in Europe. That's the point, that's the objective, namely that within the problems of health controls, the fact that you control the basic components has indeed an impact on safety and confidentiality of data of patients. This is a positive example. Of course, there are some difficulties, and I will like to give you the second example. There is the naval group within Thales, where for some years they wanted to develop a new sector for decarbonated production, the hydrolians, namely immerge or submerge centers that produce electricity on the basis of marine currents, underwater currents. This is very interesting, of course, because they are not seen like the wind aeolians, and they produce electricity. So we indeed had a failure there, because the management of the group, which more or less is the French government, decided that there were financial problems, funding problems, so that research on these alternative energy, wind energy or water energy centers was stopped. So the short term in financial terms makes it that long-term research is stopped eventually, especially regarding alternative sources of energy. And this is to do with strategy, as we were saying. So governments, European institutions do pilot large programs for the long term with the workers. That's the idea. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that the success depends on the intervention of workers within the intervention of that strategy. Thank you very much, Sylvain, for these two examples, which in fact already are positive examples. Certainly the one that was successful, namely struggling for a good cause and achieving it with a view to defending employment of workers, and the unions were able, thanks also to their vision and the knowledge about their working tool, to transform their production and eventually to achieve employment protection and being even leaders in this reconversion. And here we have good arguments and lessons to draw that are extremely important and on which we may be able to discuss and speak here. So it was shown that you don't always win your struggle. Success is not automatic, and you may be interested by the fact that green sectors lead the discussion on these topics, and we may think about how to join these reconversion plans. And now, to complete Sylvain's words, we're going to listen to a double intervention on the historical question that some of you may know about. It was a resounding fact at the time, certainly in Great Britain, and is still in the memories today and still inspire people. So I'm going to invite Hilary Meolite, who is a researcher and a journalist, to tell us about it briefly, and will be accompanied by Sam Mason from CTS in the United Kingdom to complete the whole thing. Hilary, you have the floor.
So, bonjour, everybody, and sorry for speaking English. And thank you very much, the CGT and the other organizations that have organized this. So I'll talk briefly about the story itself, and then Sam will talk about its wider reverberations and the sense in which it's been an inspiration beyond its particular history. It was a story from 40 years ago, yet it's still very much alive and a reference point. And it relates, in terms of the discussion so far, it relates to the Spanish brothers' contribution about planning. It's an example of, if you like, micro planning at a company level. It relates to all of you who stress the importance of worker involvement, because this is an example of worker-led conversion. It also relates to one or two of the questions about, you know, why should a multinational move towards a less profitable or maybe less profitable sector simply because it's of public value. And, you know, in a way, this is a reference point both of a very inspiring and positive experience of workers developing a very coherent plan, which has both environmental and anti-militaristic implications. But also it's an example of what such a plan is up against: the power of management, the way in which management defends its prerogative, its managerial prerogative, and the ways in which even Labour governments kind of acquiesce in the stance of management. So I'll just tell you very briefly the story. As Nassim said, I'm not an engineering worker. I'm a researcher and journalist. But the trade union asked me to write about their experience. So I wrote a book with them, which I can always send a summary of, unfortunately in English, but maybe Rosa Luxemburg can translate it, or a copy of the book if anybody wants it. The context was important. So there were, sorry, it's a bit hot even in England. And the context is interesting. So the context was, on the one hand, this is in the late 70s, industry, British industry, being in a state of crisis in a way. I mean, it had been very complacent, you know, resting on its imperial laurels, you know, and had not been very sort of competitive. And then in the late 70s, it faced competition from the redeveloped, reconstructed German industry and other European industries. So it became very competitive, and in defending its position and its profit margins, the first people, as we know, to be attacked and to be a source of cost cutting were the workers. So the workers were facing closures, rationalizations, and this is Lucas Aerospace is part of a big company called Lucas Industries. But even Lucas Aerospace was quite big. It had about 32 factories, and the workers there were very strong, very well organized. This was after, you know, 20 years of boom and of full employment. So they were both well organized and at a shop floor level. So we're talking here about shop floor workers, design workers, office workers, draftsmen, you know, researchers, all being in one trade union organization at the workplace. And then those organizations at the workplace connecting across factories and forming what in Britain is called a combine committee of shop stewards. So that was the context. An industry seeking to rationalize, and a trade union movement at the shop floor level and the office level, very strong and very conscious of its skills and its capacities, and also its public usefulness. And at the same time, also, there was a very radical political atmosphere, movements around peace, beginning around the environment, around feminism, and so on. This was the late 70s. And an interest in the Labour Party in new kinds of public state intervention in industry that were more democratic than the old forms of public ownership. So that was the context. The actual story is that faced with these redundancies, faced with closures, and on the other hand, faced with Minister for Industry, Tony Benn, who wanted to make contact with workers at a shop floor level and discuss with them whether or not to nationalize aerospace. He asked the workers, what do you want? And the workers went back to their organization and discussed, what should we do? You know, should we simply support public ownership, or do we need to develop our own plan as to what public ownership would be for? And the key conclusion was, okay, we need to develop our own plan. We can't just accept management's plan or even government's plan. We need our own plan. And first they asked academics for their advice. And out of 120 academics, they wrote, only about 3 replied, and those 3 became quite involved, and one of them wrote this book with me. So the Combine Committee thought, well, where do we go? And they said, well, okay, our workers, our members have the knowledge. We have the knowledge. We've been producing, you know, highly sophisticated components of aerospace. We could ask our members, what else could we produce? What else could we design? What else could our skills go towards? So the experience was then a very detailed and in a way very exemplary case of really involving the workers. And it started from a recognition of their what we call tacit knowledge. So, okay, they might not be able to write and explain exactly what they do, but their knowledge is in how they do it. So this was an important methodology in the plan. It both asked workers about the equipment and what are the resources. So it got them to think as planners. And then secondly, it instead of asking them to explain the alternatives, it actually helped and supported workers working together to design prototypes. So the plan was a mixture of a list of products in energy, in transport, in medical equipment. But then that was backed up with actual prototypes. I haven't got time to go into the detail of the plan, but I can send a summary round. But it included, you know, things that are now, you know, quite commercial, to do with electrical cars, solar technology, heat pumps, and many other ideas that actually could have been quite commercial. But I mean, what it would have involved is a shift in government procurement from military to environmental, to health. So it would have required government support, but it would have required management agreement. And in the end, management was not prepared to negotiate. You know, its sense of its prerogative was so strong, you know, that it's almost like, how dare workers actually demand to negotiate over what is produced? That's our decision, management decision. So, and in the end, government, Tony Benn was sacked, and the left in government was defeated, and government wasn't willing to stand up to management. So it's an example that has resonated ever since, because people want to see a move away from military, particularly, you know, after the end of the Cold War. You know, the military establishment is still very powerful in Britain. So there's a moral desire to move away from a militaristic economy and use the resources usefully. And then, of course, there's the commitment to a just transition. So this is a model of socially useful production led by the workers. And I think it gives us a glimpse of what that base of democratic planning would be. Obviously, there are a lot of issues. It requires conception, as the Spanish comrade discussed, of sectoral planning. And then, as Nassim mentioned, how do we coordinate different micro plans? But I think its importance is that it links democratic planning with workers' power and organization. And it points to a new kind of trade unionism, a trade unionism in which workers are seen as producers, not just wage earners. Workers' knowledge is valued, and support is given to developing their capacities. So there are lots of issues, but I better stop there and hand over to Sam.
Thanks, Hilary. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to cover, obviously, in that experience of the Lucas Aerospace workers. But I think some key points just to draw upon, following on from Hilary. As Hilary mentioned, it's had a deep resonance within the labour movement in the UK since the plan was produced in the mid-1970s, but it's had a resurgence in recent years, particularly in 2016 when there was the 40th anniversary of the plan, and I know there's some comrades on here that were very much part of organising a big conference across the trade union movement, peace movement, environmentalists, not just to commemorate the plan, but to look at how we can learn and understand the Lucas Plan experience of the shop stewards combine. For today's crisis, then it was particularly much focused around obviously the climate crisis, automation, digitalization, and increasing militarization. But I think now we'd also add on to that clearly the COVID crisis and the public health crisis that we've seen. But I think what's important for us in terms of industrial conversion and these diversification strategies is that the Lucas Plan wasn't just about saving jobs, it was about how the workers organised and put forward alternative plans and how those were developed within what Hilary called the sort of new trade unionism, which many of us feel is required today to relook at how we organise across our sectors as a labour movement. But also because it wasn't just about securing jobs, but about the human skills and value, about not wasting resources. So when we come to our just transition discussions, this is why we need to move this debate beyond the sort of where it's rooted within the retraining or social dialogue models, but looking at this as something far more transformative around the bases of power within our societies and our industrial bases for social and ecological transformation as well, but also looking at industrial democracy. So in the UK, where we have very little industrial democracy, but we tend to focus on arguing for workers' representation on boards, which of course is more common in some parts of US and other countries. But this is really about how if we want to put workers in the driving seat of the transition, of an ecological and social transition, then we have to look more about how we involve workers within that and get workers to develop their own plans, because workers will be and have to be central, obviously, to this transition. And I think, I mentioned the COVID crisis was certainly something which I saw in my own union last year around the aviation sector, which has been one of the sectors most heavily impacted by the COVID crisis for obvious reasons. We did develop our own what we call an aviation democracy plan, but a key part of that is seeing aviation as part of an integrated public transport system, but very much using the skills and knowledge of workers within the aviation sector and across all transport sectors to develop public transport in a way that is led by workers, but obviously serves public interests, not profit interests, and obviously serves the interests of the ecological crisis that we need to address as part of this. So we've had some other good collaborations as well and initiatives coming out. So from sort of local combines of trades councils or trade unions coming together to look at how we can have plans for doing a mass retrofit of housing, for example, in Leeds, which is in Yorkshire in the UK. And we've got lots of groups working around looking at how we can diversify our economy out of the defence and militaristic economy, particularly around nuclear weapons, but not solely around nuclear weapons. And of course, with the situation with Palestine and Gaza right now, has initiated a big debate, quite rightly, on weapons manufacture. And when we have so many gaping needs for social and ecological work, that where those workers' resources and also funding can be redirected into there. So I think it's useful for us to look at these discussions and how we apply them, not just in a sort of industrial basis, but in a broad sectorial basis and how it interlinks. And we don't lose what we're seeing now because of the COVID crisis, a mass globally in the UK, but of course globally, of workers' skills and knowledge across a range of sectors that are losing their jobs because of the COVID crisis. So this is exactly the time when we need to be using the Lucas example to keep hold of these skills and workers and come up with strategies to do that on a militant basis in terms of the trade unions fighting for those jobs, but the plans and transition pathways for those workers. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à Hilary et Sam pour
Thank you very much, Sam and Hilary, for these examples and for somehow dissecting the conditions that that accompanied these actions. In the 70s, as Hilary said, when there was a very strong union movement and action that had an impact on society at large. But again, what Sam was also presented, and Sylvain as well, is the dialectic that can exist within the environmental transition and the crises that are very foremost in our mind today, and the union forces, namely the workers, how they can be at the very center of such responses, and also why not encourage the unions to occupy this central role, not simplifying things and always showing them as always attacking, but and defending themselves. I think these examples are extremely inspiring, in my view. We have many questions, and I feel like hearing them, these are questions from the participants, to have an even better debate. The first question had to do with international exchanges, free trade agreements that are still multiplying. We have the European Union that is discussing these points with Mercosur, and the idea was whether this was towards reconversion or not. Another question had to do with this. What are, in your view, the good examples? I'm just cherry picking these questions. What could be the good examples of or proposal for transition and planning transition in the various industries or sectors of industry, or even within companies, perhaps at a larger level? And finally, there was a question on the importance of the link and the relationship between unions and the question of research, the link, communication with researchers, scientific people. How do you approach this? Do you see there a strong link to establish with them? Well, I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about it. And if you have an idea, you can raise your hand with the button you have on your screen if you're a panelist. And I will give you the floor by turns. I can see Carlos. There is a list there. Carlos first had raised his hand.
Thank you. I'll try to respond to the question by focusing on good examples of planning for transition, good transition plans. In my country, in Spain, we've had very good results, but it's true that we have had to spend a great deal of time trying to strategically plan for a good energy transition. We had a lot of plans on coal mining, and I have to say that the results haven't been very good because in the mining regions, employment has not increased in the way that was expected, taking into account the number of jobs that were removed by removing the coal mining. So we found many problems in terms of employment with these plans. Another important aspect in these plans and their application is the resistance that we face in these territories. The idea that workers have to accept the fact that coal is going to disappear, and that the EU had set up a limit in 2018 where they would have to leave the coal sector, and these mines had to be closed. And it's true that this was met with a lot of resistance, and I think there were not sufficient support measures in these regions. However, we do have a just transition plan for thermal plants and for nuclear plants that has been very well set, very well planned. Comisiones Obreras really agrees with it because it is based on just transition agreements, collective agreements. They take into account the closure conditions, but we see that one of the problems is that it's taking a lot of time. It sets up a participatory program where different parts, different actors are consulted, and this is taking a lot of time, and it's taking a lot of patience, because we also have to wait for the European recovery funds, the just transition funds, and so forth. So I think it's well planned, it's well focused, but it's taking time. So it takes time to be able to see the results. It takes a lot of time, and it is a rather slow procedure if we look at the unemployment in these areas. Thank you.
Je crois qu'on a Sylvain ensuite sur la...
Ouais. The next one to take the floor will be Sylvain. Do you hear me? Yes. So we have Sylvain who wanted to answer a question. Yes, very good questions in the chat. On the relationship between the workers and the researchers, it's clear in Grenoble, and this is one of their advantages. We could count on the help of a community that understand very well that these are transversal issues. Health, medical health are this kind of issues. But what's the social cost of health in the gross domestic product today of a country? It's enormous, and this is because of the population situation in Europe. So on one side, the social expenses on health are very important, and the fact that the company is French European, that is, and that this company controls production of these components that are used in the medical world, this has also an economical sense. I don't want to be protectionist, but today, as I already said, it's essentially General Electric Medicals, the Japanese companies, and also the German companies, which are the masters of the game. So we have a social engagement here that we have to respect. It's all the question of the autonomy and the industrial sector, the fact that we have projects that are open to cooperation. Of course, it's not that we want to close borders. ST Microelectronics in Europe is a multinational company, but historically it's European. So considering the ecological transition, one of the topics that come up is the enormous consumption of the digital devices and the think only of the Bitcoin. Its consumption is in internet is equivalent to the annual consumption of electricity in Canada. So this also has an impact on the environment, and there we need the scientists to work about the question, the engineers and the company strategists and the big entrepreneurs must think of the new components that can be used for artificial intelligence, neural networks, quantum computers, which already are a very complex element themselves, and develop the Internet of Things. We talked a lot of the 5G with the problem of the Chinese components, which was one of the problems, but all the calculation potency that we have today with this hyperconnection and the capacity of access to the internet has an ecological price. The consumption of the digital consumption is about the same as that of the 12th biggest consumer of electricity in the world. So if the growth follows the same exponential trend, it means that we will also need to work with the scientists and the researchers on what kind of components we have to work on, their architecture, because otherwise we will have data centers everywhere, which will increase the temperature of the atmosphere in excess. So, to conclude, the workers are very often right to ask to go on with medical developments in 2012, whereas the management also only thought of the military development. But you have to diversify if you want to have good results. But you also need to take into account the opinion of researchers. And finally, the recovery plans in Europe, as we consider them in CGT, are totally insufficient if we compare them to what happens in the US or in China. And so the importance of research cannot be stressed enough in these recovery plans. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Je vais maintenant passer tout de suite.
Thank you very much. I will now give the floor to Guillaume.
Oui, pour concernant la question sur,
Yes.
sur les accords de libre-échange.
With the question on the free trade agreements, there's an important component that we must not forget, and that we find in all these agreements, is how to solve the disputes between states. When a state decides to make modifications in the free trade agreement, this can have its impact on the environmental plan. So we have to think of mechanisms allowing to find a compensation for these changes, so that the state can reimburse the prejudice suffered. And we also have to consider the right of the workers. In the last version of the LNA, in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, the trade unions asked for this mechanism for solving disputes to be removed from the agreement. And in the context of the renegotiation of the agreements with President Trump, we were able to remove this burden of the capital, which went against the democratic will of protecting our environment. When we look at the free trade agreements. There already are breaks within these agreements. There are always ways to find a way to find an economical arrangement, but we must participate in the discussions, and even if we're not invited, impose to be invited so that we can have our claims be listened to in the negotiations of the free trade agreements. So this is what I wanted to say, because I also believe that not only in the LNA there is a free trade agreement that will be negotiated with the United Kingdom as a consequence of the Brexit, and we would not like the mechanisms for the dispute settlement to be included in this new agreement. So we do not want to have this dispute settlement to be included in these agreements, because this represents a risk for the rights of workers and for the environment. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Guillaume, pour cette réponse. Et oui, au moment où on parle
Guillaume, for your contribution. And in Europe, we are talking a lot about the European Charter on Energy. We will now listen to Hillary, and then I have several new questions that were risen. Talking about the case in Korea too, we will try to speed up things and be able to answer those questions. So Hillary, you have the floor.
Okay, so I'll be brief. It was an answer to the question about the relationship between workers and academics. Well, I mean, academics are workers too, but between trade unionists fighting for alternatives and academics and scientists. And that, as I mentioned, was important in the development of the Lucas Plan. But I think what's important is to recognize that it depends a lot on the, if you like, the politics or values of the scientific community. So in the 70s, maybe after the repercussions of 1968, there was quite a radical spirit amongst scientists and experts. So there was a movement called the British Society for Responsibility in Science, and it was scientists who'd been part of the movement against the Vietnam War, and around napalm and so on, and the use of science or abuse of science. So that they were very responsive in the end to the working with the Lucas workers. And I think the other important thing is the question of, in a way, democratization of knowledge, that there was then a recognition of different kinds of knowledge. Again, I think a repercussion of 68. So the sort of idea of scientific knowledge in the law-like, the codified sense as being the only kind of knowledge was demystified, and there was a recognition of tacit and practical knowledge and the need to combine the two. So now you have, on the one hand, a very significant narrowing of the university, the scope for university research due to the impact of neoliberalism. So the space for academics and academic scientists to work with workers in the way that I did, for example, or many of my colleagues did, doesn't really exist. We have to fight for it. But on the other hand, there is a new radicalization of scientists. I mean, one of the other questions to come is the importance of the Extinction Rebellion movement and whether unions should be supporting it. And that movement has influenced, as has the student strikes led by Greta Thunberg. I mean, that's influenced academics and scientists. So there's now a new basis, I think, for a collaboration between trade unionists and scientists. And I think that the trade union movement should grasp that opportunity and create the kind of spaces where a truly collaborative and therefore democratic, egalitarian relationship can develop. I mean, that's happening through the new Lucas plan that Sam talked about, and through work that a local Green New Deal is doing with workers in Rolls-Royce. So I think the Green New Deal movement is a key means of linking scientists and trade unionists.
Merci, merci
Thank
beaucoup,
you.
Hilary.
Thank you very much, Hilary.
Donc j'ai une salve de questions.
I have
Vous avez
an
déjà
authentic
commencé déjà à y répondre.
bombing of
Cette deuxième
questions
question qui s'adresse du coup
here. But I have a question that I have picked out that refers to the French case, and this can maybe be extended on other questions. There's the agreement strategy with the government for the industry or the industrial plan. The agreements, the industrial agreements with the government, are they really working? Do we have examples in Europe where that really can be illustrative? This is maybe a question for Sylvain or maybe for the Spanish representative, if our colleague is still there. So we have this second question also related to the fact that whether in Korea workers considered the job protection and the question of training rather than to become central agents in the industrial retransformation. And I believe, and this is central to what we're talking about today, how can trade unions create an independent movement and strengthen themselves using these proposals without being shot in the legs by the government, or in cases like the Lucas plan. So please take the floor to answer this question, or maybe consider alliances with other groups like environmental defense groups. Sylvain would like to give an answer or take the floor. Yes, it's very complex. All issues related to energy are very complex. We were talking previously on how science can be recognized. Science has been criticized a lot, especially with the COVID crisis. It is questioned very often. We're not going to take a trade union position on the nuclear energy or things like that. But we can maybe say, for example, that it can be dangerous to to shift all the production to electrical vehicles production. Many of our workers would not be able to, who could not afford a car anymore. So there are a series of considerations you have to have. Historically, the first car that was able to break the 100 km/h barrier was an electrical car. So this car was already a big performance a very long time ago. But I believe we should not think only of one solution, energetically speaking or environmentally speaking, but we have to think together collectively. And it's not the big capitalistic groups that will give a solution. I will give an example, the Galileo affair. In 1999, the European Commission decided to have an independent GPS system, independent from Russia and the US. So the Galileo project was launched. Today, I am a European citizen. I buy a GPS device on the market. I want to access the Galileo system. 22 years later, I still have no access to any Galileo service. So the European policies were incapable of having an industrial instrument and bring it to life. Another example, it's the European cloud. The American laws, in particular in California, are extraterritorial, and so as our data are stored on data centers in California, it's the Californian law that the companies have to abide by. So it's an American judge who will give his opinion on your health data, for example. So the Europe reacts, says, let's build a European cloud, but with what? With Chinese or American components? So the question is not to think of an abstract policy, but you need to have an industrial sector to back up your ideas and see what are the true components that you are controlling from A to Z, and then be able to set up an architecture so that we can control our data in Europe. When I look at the Galileo experience, I'm quite concerned. And if you think of all the investment that was done by the public and the private sector, what do the private sector do in technology? They outsource it to countries which are outside of our borders. So, I mean, yes, trade unions are pushing for a true strategy, but at the end, we are in a situation where policies have to be applied differently. Thank you very much, Sylvain. I believe that this question of the sectors, the value chains and their impact also on ecology has come back very often. And this is something that will be discussed in a roundtable this afternoon, in the industry roundtable that you are warmly invited to, because as very often was said here today, many of the questions are interconnected. And it's sometimes we need to clean up everything. I don't know if anybody needed to give another answer to the questions that were made or answered to some of the comments that were made now.
If not, I would also like to present you another point, namely the role and the impact of PMEs and very small enterprises as well in the sector of industry, and what role we could imagine for them within that transition. How could we include these questions, these issues that are also to be updated or are current, in fact? And I wouldn't want to forget other questions. I did indeed. Thank you, Jean-Claude, for reminding me. Unfortunately, I didn't see it. It's the question or the role of the military sector in the transition. We've mentioned the feeble funding status. We mentioned one that receives a lot of funding in Europe and in the United States as well. But how this question of the military and industrial sector is part of the whole panorama of reconversion, because we know that the military sector is one of the greatest polluter or emissions producer. What could the strategy be as well? We've seen that had also pushed the workers to be not only present in the military sector. A while ago, Hillary mentioned the impact in social terms when the Vietnam War was going. And this problematic also became then a society, a massively society problem. How could we coordinate all these aspects, in fact? We have Sam, who wishes to answer, after which we'll try to have some conclusions by each one. Sam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nassim. Just a few comments, and thank you, Jean-Claude, for your question. I did see it in the chat earlier, so I think it's a really important point, and particularly in the context of NATO meeting this week. You've just released a climate action plan, and the UK government itself has released its own strategic defence review this year as well. And from the UK perspective, we're seeing the biggest increase in defence military spending for 70 years, including proposed increase of 40% of nuclear warheads. So it's been a very active discussion in the UK for a long while about defence diversification, which, as Hillary mentioned in her initial comments, related to the Lucas plan, because of course that was all part of the discussion that came out, the peace movement, because they worked on military contracts for 50% of the production at the Lucas Aerospace factory. So we have been trying to develop through a number of trade union groups, the peace movement, including some environmental groups, about how we can achieve defence diversification in the UK, and interestingly in Scotland, where the nuclear defence deterrent is housed, or where it is, the Scottish TUC is against nuclear weapons, for example. So it's a very difficult discussion from a trade union perspective, because obviously there are a number of jobs linked, not just directly in military, but across the supply chains as well. So there is some hostility to this, unsurprisingly, but we did manage to get agreement through the Trade Union Congress a couple of years ago to establish what we called, to work with the Labour Party to set up a shadow defence diversification agency, which, if you like, will be part of a broader industrial strategy to look at a just transition for workers within the defence sector. And under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, this is something that he has always been very interested in and supportive of, although it wasn't wider Labour Party policy. Clearly, with the changes of the leadership in the Labour Party, that's become a different debate, but it's something which we are still pursuing. And unfortunately, where we did have some success under the Tony Blair government in the 90s, where a defence diversification agency was set up, it was actually set up under a kind of marketized basis, where it wasn't really about producing the jobs that we'd certainly be arguing for as part of the ecological and sort of social transformations, but really about bringing products to market for the defence sector. So equally understandably, there's a lot of reticence from the trade unions about the realities of defence diversification and transition, but it's a very active and live debate in the UK, and I completely agree with Jean-Claude that we need to obviously relook at our whole security and defence agenda, particularly in the context of climate change, but just obviously not exclusively because of that. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Sam. The time has come to conclude, and I thank you already, but perhaps I'd like to underline a last sentence, if you wish, that you could give us on the possibilities for an international and internationalist union movement in order to help towards these various proposals for reconversion, the various projects, the various visions? What are the possibilities in each of your situations? The possibility of linking all unions within the world movement, if you wish to express yourself, and I thank you already. Sylvain would like to take the floor, I think. Yes, about the military, to conclude. We also have the previous experience of what we call the peace dividends from the 90s, when several military subventions were stopped with the disappearance of the Soviet Union. So this is something of 20 years of age, and there were new reconversion trends. For instance, anti-cars collision radars were developed instead, and we see them in our cars today when you are reversing. Also, new things were done in the field of fisheries, where the ships or the boats were helped not to have collisions. So we're not starting from scratch, really. There are old things that are always reusable or reactivable, and certain unions, the CGT among them, want to help the workers to install new strategies for reconversion and transition. Perhaps a last word by Hilary.
A kind of concluding point for me, which is that, you know, the climate emergency has made the issue of the just transition and the issue of conversion far more, if you like, hegemonic than in the 1970s with the Lucas Plan. So that there's a much greater opportunity for a unified movement, both unified between workers, shop floor workers and union leaders, between progressive political parties and the trade union movement, between academics and the trade union movement. And that I think that there's also recognition that this has to be international. So I just feel, I don't know about optimistic, but I feel it's kind of realistic to try and build this kind of international movement. I mean, you know, many of us maybe were involved in things like the World Social Forum and the European Social Forum, which were, you know, important and created many relationships that we can now build on. But I feel that this is much more practical, and we can build much more collective power this way. So I really hope that the CGT and other organizations involved will think very practically about how to carry on from this important meeting this week. And I mean, I'm sure Sam and I will do all we can to bring parts of the British trade union movement involved. We're not very powerful, but we can do our best.
Eh bien, ce seront sur ces mots qu'on fera résonner.
Well, these will be the last words about the importance of practicality and relationship between the various forces, and we are going to say goodbye. I'd like to thank our interpreters, our panelists, of course, interpreters that had difficult conditions, and also the various participants. And we will soon meet again for a new panel after this one at 13:50. Sorry, 15.